Avodah Zarah is such an interesting concept. Rav Ghibli was speaking to me the other day about how if a person denies God's existence altogether, it's not great, but it's not Avodah Zarah. A person says, no, I believe in a divine force, I believe in a godly force, but it manifests for me in this object, in this tree, or in the statue, or whatever it is that he's observing. Then we get this enormous set of very severe halachot of Avodah Zarah. Why is objectifying God worse than denying him? That's really one of the fundamental questions in Avodah Zarah. And when he raised it with me, I thought to myself, my goodness, we should have been asking that question right at the very beginning of the parak. That underlies the whole parak. What is it that Hashem gets so angry about? It should be ridiculous. A person thinks that a tree is God. A person thinks that a statue is God. We should laugh it off. It's crazy. We know how we would feel as human beings. If somebody denies your existence, doesn't see you, doesn't speak to you, just ignores you, that's terrible. If somebody says, well, I think this chair is you, that's what I think. I identify you as a chair. We would just laugh at that. It would be completely ridiculous. Why doesn't the Rebbe just laugh it off? Why does he take it so seriously when somebody practices or believes in idolatry? A really fundamental question, which we'll begin to touch today in Objects of Idolatry Can Disgust One. השוכר, הפועל on Avodah Zarah Daf Samach Beis Amud Aleph. The shir has been generously sponsored by Rabbi Hilkovitz, and we thank you, Rabbi, for being here every morning, for stepping in to Rav Ghibli's shoes when he's not here. And you're being here, it's with all things. We spoke on Shabbos about how one projects energy to people and people reflect that energy back, and it's even more so when it comes to a shir, that the people who are sitting in the shir reflect an energy certainly back to the person who's giving the shir, and you've experienced that yourself when you give a shir, and you give a lot of energy off when you're in the shir. I feel it. I see on your face you're getting it. There's just a beautiful getting it. And I wondered until we talked the other day, and you told me about your grandfather, about your Zayda, in whose honor we're dedicating the shir. I wondered where that comes from, because that somebody wants to learn Torah, it's fine. Somebody learns Torah, has got a good mind, all of that, that's fine. That somebody had experience, you've learned Torah, you've learned in yeshiva, that's fine. But the neshama dika lighting up of your face when there's a chidush in Torah, I've thought to myself, that has to come from somewhere. And then you told me about your Zayda, Dr. Soli Shippel. Dr. Soli Shippel was a very close friend of my father. And it's interesting, my father's close friends were not the Frum Jews in Johannesburg. The Frum Jews were from the Yekisha community. They were German Jews. My father's close friends were from the Lithuanian community, but the Lithuanians weren't Frum in the normal sense of the word. Each one, they kept different levels, kashrus, tried to keep Shabbos a bit, come to shul, but they weren't Frum people as we would. And those were his friends. He had a few really close friends. And with the Shippels, which includes, it was Dr. and Mrs. Shippel and his 3 children, which included Robbie's mother. We used to go on picnics together, and I remember that. I must have been 6 or 7, maybe 10 years old. And I remember those drives. Once we went to Little Falls outside Johannesburg. I remember that particular one in your grandfather's car. And I remember the car, but most of all, I remember the conversation. Just thinking about the quality of conversation. As a little child, I used to notice that my parents were having with their friends. And these were people that my father always used to speak about their midas, just what wonderful people they were. And that's how he chose his friends, as wonderful people with roots in the Lithuanian tradition, even if they themselves weren't from. And little would I know that many years later, Dr. Shippel's grandson would be sitting in the shir every single morning, and we'd be learning together every single morning. How would one know? He was a man of great principle and emunah. He was a massive academic and educator. He was a professor in the medical school in Johannesburg, trained a generation or more than one generation of South African physicians. I'm sure if Dr. Howie was here, he would have known him.
He was in Cape Town. So.
Oh, he was in Cape Town. And he would say, I look into my microscope and I see God. So is that a frum person or is that not a frum person? Our measures of what is frum and what isn't frum have become so distorted. And I understand that that's the kind of person my father wanted to be friends with. Tell me more about what you see in your microscope. That's what they used to talk about. Tell me how you see Hashem. Tell me about some new discovery in your field. The worst thing is when the Talmid Chacham is sitting with an amateur Talmid Chacham, and all the amateur wants to talk about is his Divrei Torah, his Chidushim, and what he saw in Art Scroll, and what he saw on the internet, and what he heard in a shir. It's so boring for the Talmid Chacham. But if the person is able to, I look in my microscope and I see God, that's something the Talmid Chacham can't do. My father couldn't do that. He could learn a Daf Gemara, so he didn't need his friends to try and teach him Gemara. He needed his friends to teach him things he couldn't access. And that's what they used to talk about on those long trips in the car. And we used to sit as children fascinated by those conversations. So thank you, Robbie, for alerting me to the kesher and for being here and being who you are, and certainly for sponsoring this shiur. The Mishnah says, the beginning of our new parak, the fifth parak of Avodah Zarah, השוכר את הפועל לעשות עמו ביין נסך. If a person is dealing with yain nesech, this is now wine that Rashi says has actually been used for Avodah Zarah, and he hires a Jew as a worker to empty the barrels, move the barrels, to work in the winery. Scharo asur. An amazing thing that the Mishnah says, not just that asur or that he shouldn't do that, but the money he makes for his wages is forbidden. It's an osabano. You can't use that money. Ask the Gemara, my time as charosu, why is the charosu? And the Gemara goes into a whole discussion. And eventually Rabbi Yochanan comes out and says, Knasu shikansu chachamim b'chamarimu v'yayin nesech. This is a unique knas. It's like a fine, which the Chachomim instituted for these particular people. The Chamorim were the drivers of donkey carts that used to deal in shvius and in food from the Shemitah year, which we won't go into now, and into people who work with yain nesech, who work in wineries with yain nesech. Says the Ritva and others, scharo asur l'chol adam. It's not just that he's not allowed to benefit from his schar, it's osur ba'ano. Nobody can have benefit from this. Which raises the underlying question of this piece of Gemara, which is, a knas usually means I'm fining an individual so that you don't do it. You're fined for speeding. You're fined for parking in the wrong place. It's in order that you'll stop doing it. It's to disincentivize people from doing those things. But here the knas is different. The knas seems to attach to the money. He gets $100 for working a few hours in the yekev, in the winery, and that $100 is also. He can't even give it to somebody else. Somebody else can't benefit from it. That's not a knas. What is that? Where does that come from? Says the Rambam, a very strange Rambam. We've already established that if something is asur b'hana'ah, and this is from our Gemara goes into this in quite a lot of detail. If something is forbidden to have benefit from, some things you're not allowed to do. Some things, the object becomes also. You can't use the object. But some are asur b'hana'ah, which means you can't even get indirect benefit from the object, which means you can't sell the object. You can't give away the object to somebody else. The object actually becomes a chefza shel isur, an object that becomes asur, sometimes not only for you and not only for Jewish people, but altogether to do anything with it. You've got to, as we've said, we've had cases, take it to the Dead Sea and just let it erode there. You can't have any benefit from it. Says the Rambam, that generally, if something is forbidden to have benefit from it, im avaru mecharo, if you sold it, which you shouldn't have done, mutarin. The money you made out of selling it is mutar. The object remains asur, the object remains prohibited, but the money you gained from selling the object is mutar, you're allowed to use that object. Chutz me'avodah zarah meshamsheh v'tikrovit shelo v'yayin nesech shenit nasech lo, excepting for our Masechta. In Avodah Zarah, including yain nesech, including wine which has been used for idolatrous purposes, in this case, even if you sell it, the money you gain from the sale is also asur. Etc. Therefore, Akum shesacharit Yisrael, an idol worshipper who hired a Jew, la'asot imo beyayin, to work in his winery, secharo asur, his wages are forbidden. And they're a proper asur, isur, even the wages are forbidden. And the Lechem Mishnah asks, what's the Rambam linking it to the first part of it? The first part, the Rambam says, generally, if something is asur b'hana, if you're not allowed to have benefit from it, if you sold it, which you should not have done, the money you got from selling it is already too distant from the object, and the money is forbidden, excepting Avodah Zarah. And therefore, lefichach, even wages gained from working in a yain nesech winery, those wages themselves are also asur. What's the connection? What is the Rambam trying to say? And we'll see that the Giloy and Marsha are notes of Reb Shlomo Eiger on the Shulchan Aruch. Very beautiful, amazing notes. Reb Shlomo Eiger was the son of Rabbi Kiva Eiger. Rabbi Kiva Eiger we've talked about a lot, the son-in-law of the Chassam Sofer. Particularly recently, we've spoken about this chain of Masorah quite frequently. And the son of Rabbi Kiva Eiger is Reb Shlomo Eiger. Reb Shlomo writes the Giloy and Marsha on the Shulchan Aruch. And he links the Rambam to our Tosfos, where our Tosfos says, in this case specifically, this strange law applies, where even the money gained from working in the winery becomes asur. Now you can't even have benefit from it. It's a little bit like the money that you get from selling avodah zarah. So we've got three cases. Normally, you sell something which is asur b'hana'ah, something you're not allowed to have benefit from. You sell it. You shouldn't sell it, but you did. The money is mutar. The money is permitted. Avodah zarah, if you sell it, the money becomes asur. So the object, the idol that you sold, contaminates the money you gained from selling it. And it's a little bit like that. To work with idolatry and translate that work into money, which is your wages for working in the winery, that money also gets contaminated midirabonon. The rabbi is contaminated. But in other areas of Isur Hano, the Tosfos is going into why this is so. Why is it that Yain Nesech, in the case of Avodah Zarah, in the case of idolatry, the money gained from the sale of an idol is contaminated by the idol. It's not just the idol which is also, it's the value of the idol which becomes contaminated, which ties into Rav Jibli's question. Why to such an extent? Why is God so worried about these crazy little idols that even the money from the sale becomes contaminated with the Isur of Avodah Zarah? And that's unique to Avodah Zarah and Shvius, which is a different question. But it's unique to Avodah Zarah because this taken further, the Chachomim extend it further and say, and therefore even if you work in the winery, the money you gain from the work is also asur, that also cannot be used. That's in our Tosfos, and that will explain the Rambam. Why? So I found Rabbeinu Yonason Bilunil. I've told you before about Rabbeinu Yonason Bilunil. So it's 13th century Provence. He's a Talmud of the Raavad. The Raavad is the Rambam's nemesis. Right? The Raavad goes out of his way to undo anything that the Rambam says which is innovative and new. The Rabbeinu Yonason is a close Talmud of the Raavad, but loves the Rambam. And he writes to the Rambam, he writes 20 very difficult questions to the Rambam, very afraid of how the Rambam will react, because this is now the Raavad's Talmud sending 20 questions to the Rambam, and the Rambam writes this beautiful letter back saying, your questions show me how seriously you've learnt my work, how deeply you've understood it. I love your questions. I'm so happy you asked them, and I'm answering every single one of these questions carefully because I so appreciate it. That was Rabbeinu Yonason Bilunil. So it's important to understand his relationship with the Rambam. And he says an interesting thing, without really explaining it. He says because knasa kansu otor chachomim, the chachomim introduced this knas, and as we've pointed out, it's an unusual knas because knas is a fine and usually is to prevent the person from doing something wrong, and many Rishonim learn that that's what this is here. But the Rambam doesn't learn it that way, and the Ritva doesn't learn it that way, and others, they learn that this is essential in the object itself. Why? Yes, we don't want him to hire himself to work in Avodah Zarah with something as disgusting as idolatry and yain nesach. That's an interesting concept. So he introduces the idea that there's something mo'us, there's something disgusting in the object itself. It's yach. Just to see it, you look at it, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just a work of art. And we've talked about how you can be mevatel, you can take the avodah zarah out of an object and leave it as a work of art. But as long as it is an idol, it's disgusting, it's mo'us. Why is it disgusting and not ridiculous? Ridiculous, you laugh off, you ignore. Disgusting, you are disgusted. It arouses a sense of disgust in you. What is the disgust that avodah zarah arouses in you? And I believe, and hopefully we'll have more opportunity to talk about this. When you deny something like the Rebbeinu Shalom, that's one thing, and we'll understand why that's less serious than Avodah Zarah. What is Avodah Zarah? Avodah Zarah is you quantify the unquantifiable. The moment you take Hashem and give him dimensions, these are his dimensions. What are you doing in addition to giving him dimensions, which is a terrible thing? You're also excluding him from everything outside of those dimensions. This is Hashem. So therefore, what happens in the rest of the world is not Hashem. This is where Hashem resides. The idea of Ein Od Milvado, the idea that we reside in Hashem, Hashem doesn't reside in the world resides in Hashem, and that Hashem is inside us. Hashem is experienced, we feel Hashem. To take an object, a quantified object, and say, this is Hashem, to quantify the unquantifiable. That's Avodah Zarah, because once you quantify the unquantifiable, it loses potential. That's why we say in Brocha Ela B'Dover Asomu Min Ha'ayin. Once you've done your annual figures, once your accountant has given you your profit and loss for the year, there's no chance of Brocha. Brocha closes. Brocha is when potential is undefined. As long as you don't know how much you've got, there can still be bracha. There can still be much more than you thought you had. But once you've given it dimensions, that's it. Quantification limits possibilities. And in quantum mechanics, that's a well-known concept, isn't it? That once you quantify, you're limiting potential. As long as you haven't quantified, anything's possible. There's any potential. Until you've observed a scientific phenomenon, it can do anything. You don't even know what it will do. You can't even imagine what it will do. Once you've quantified it, you've limited it altogether. That's the mos. To take something unquantifiable, something qualitative, something experiential, and give it quantities. That's something which is Avodah Zarah. You've all experienced, I'm sure, trying to take a photograph of the Grand Canyon or of the Himalayas. A photograph can't do justice to it, no matter how good the photograph is. It's quantified. It doesn't matter how big you make the photograph. It doesn't matter. You can go to an IMAX theater. It doesn't matter. It's been quantified into an object, into a thing you can touch. When you see something which is so magnificent, you can't quantify it. And we do that very often. And unfortunately, we're doing that in Torah as well. Once we start taking the Ribbono Shel Olam and putting him into institutions, that's where he is. That's where the Ribbono Shel Olam is. Once we take Torah and we turn it into data, we turn Torah into information which we can access digitally, and that's Torah. We've taken Torah and we've quantified it. We've put it on a server. We've put it on a USB stick. As wonderful a tool as that is, we've got to be very careful never to confuse Torah with that. When I'm learning and I access something on the internet, if I have the Sefer, and I try to make sure that I have the Sefer, the first thing I do is take the Sefer out and learn it in the Sefer, not to learn it on a screen. Don't think the Torah are pixels on a screen. Don't think the Torah are bytes on a USB stick or on a hard drive. Torah is something unlimited and unquantifiable. And when we take the unquantifiable and we quantify it, we compress it and restrict it and minimize it, no matter how big the thing is. Once you've quantified it, you've limited its potential and you've removed that Kedusha, you've moved the potential Kedusha from everywhere else other than the quantities that you've given it, that little space that you've given it, which you're master of, so that you control it. You've absolutely destroyed the godliness of what you're trying to preserve. And that becomes not only a denial of God, which we deal with. A person's a kofar, he denies God, he doesn't get treated like an oved Avodah Zarah. But once you quantify God, once you give God dimensions, there's nothing that is mo'is ka'avodah zarah chiyai nesef. Nothing in the world is as disgusting as giving quantifiable dimensions to that which is infinite and unquantifiable.